Hello to everyone and welcome to the webinar. Thank you for joining us tonight in talking about that journey beyond the trauma of child sexual abuse. I guess I wanted to say at the outset that I want to acknowledge the incredibly harmful and long-term impact child sexual abuse trauma has, but at the same time also acknowledge the incredible strength, knowledge and resilience of survivors who have taught us so much about what it is to recover, what it is to find a way through such trauma over long periods. So I'm just going to, here we go. So what I want to do just in a very short amount of time was just take us through a lens on how we might understand the impacts of child sexual abuse and what helps build healing and recovery. And I guess traditionally the way we've come to understand it often has been through what we might call a medical model. So the lens of a medical model, need to go back a bit. Yeah, a medical model is very much a model that talks about language like healing, recovery, and treatments, some of that kind of language. And it's really helped us in a number of ways. If we can get to the next slide. It's very much about treating trauma. We talked about language such as post-traumatic stress and complex post-traumatic stress, and we talked about treatments like therapy and counselling, EMDR, medications, and so forth. And I think the medical model has brought a level of understanding and a level of description for survivors' experience of trauma that resonates strongly with some of those PTSD concepts, particularly around traumatic memories, about the effects of hypervigilance, and the struggles of being able to move beyond that. And some of that has also been helped by our understanding of, maybe a slide back, our understanding of the way the brain works. And in particular, our brains are both impacted by trauma hugely, and no wonder so many survivors talk about the fact that it's difficult to overcome some of the impacts, that it's hard for the past to become part of the past when it keeps intruding into the present. And it's hard to move on as much as one would like to. And so we've come to understand that trauma tends to get stuck inside our brains and re-experienced rather than remembered. But we also have come to understand that the brain is an incredibly resilient organ and it's capable of great repair. And so we also know that the brain is sometimes what we call plastic, and that's able to change. And that's been a really important part of understanding that process in a medical model paradigm of how we might be able to overcome some of those impacts. So that's a kind of important lens for us to look at trauma, and gives legitimacy to, I think, to many survivors' experience of trauma. There's another lens in which we might also look at trauma, and that is a paradigm of what we might call loss and grief. And I know this is particularly resonates for people from different cultural groups, and certainly our Aboriginal brothers and sisters that we acknowledged in the start of this presentation. And many survivors will have resonance with that sense of loss, the loss of a safe and secure attachment, that loss of a right to have a safe and secure childhood, deprived of things that give you innocence and safety and well-being as a child. So lots of mourning and grief about loss of those things. But there's also loss in the current, in the present day, that loss of current well-being, that it's hard to often overcome the impacts of hypervigilance of the impacts of depression and anxiety, the impacts of trying to find trusting and secure, safe relationships. And also the loss of what could have been had this not happened. What would my life have been like now? So there's a loss of a sense of the past, the present and the future at times for some survivors. And we must always acknowledge and honour what that has been like for many survivors. But we also know out of loss and grief come mourning and growing. And we must recognise those losses. We must honour them. We must also, though, know that as a community, that we truly and deeply hear survivors' stories, that we are open to hearing those things. And there's also a recognition of one's resourcefulness, that out of such trauma comes a digging deep into the reservoir of resourcefulness that we all have within ourselves, that we can draw on, that children learn to draw on throughout the abuse periods of their lives. And with that also comes as a community recognition, support and justice. And I guess the biggest example of that has probably been in recent times, the Child Abuse Royal Commission, that as a community we were really forced into looking at this issue in a much broader context than individual impacts and trauma and treatment, but recognising that as a community we have denied, ignored, closed our eyes to and not responded to survivors. And at times we've re-traumatised survivors and made things a lot worse for them in how we have and haven't responded. And for healing to take place, there is a need also for community recognition, support and justice. So I want to draw our attention to a different view of trauma, a recognition that being abused is not just a mental health problem, it's actually a human rights violation, which impacts on mental health. And that is such an important paradigm for us to think about when we view the lens of child abuse trauma. It's not simply an individual misfortune, it is literally a public health problem of major proportions. And we saw that at the Child Abuse Royal Commission. We saw survivors coming forward by the thousands to tell their story, many of whom had never told their story before. And the Commission, representing the government and the people of Australia, stood shoulder to shoulder with survivors to say, we've not served survivors well, we've not responded in the way we should. And we have to take responsibility for this issue to protect children in the future, but also to address the harm done to survivors. And I think that's a very important part of healing for survivors. They shouldn't have to bear the full responsibility of having to heal themselves when we as a community need to step up and take responsibility about why abuse happened to them in the first place and what we could be doing and should be doing to protect survivors and children in the future. So I wanted to just finish by talking about some of those healing pathways. The images in this picture remind me of the movement that started during the Royal Commission years between 2013 and 2017. And this was called the Coloured Ribbon campaign. And what had happened in the Coloured Ribbon campaign was that many of the institutions where abuse occurred, coloured ribbons were tied onto the fences of those institutions in recognition of the survivors who had suffered in those places. And I guess if we did that in homes and institutions and places of abuse across Australia, it would be covered in ribbons. The bottom picture is a picture of one of the survivors at the national apology that occurred in 2018, where the Australian government apologised to survivors of child sexual assault, and a sculptured ribbon tree was made and put up in Canberra, where survivors can come and hang a ribbon on that tree in recognition of what they and others have suffered. So in closing, I just want to say something about those healing pathways. And the Coloured Ribbon campaign was an example of a community standing with survivors and recognising what had happened to them and taking some responsibility to give voice to their experience and their story, and that giving voice to the language of trauma to be heard, believed, valued, and for some justice to be given is a really important part that we have as a community in facilitating the healing of survivors. Additionally, that sense of safety, and I'm sure Renee will talk about that when she talks shortly, that need to experience safety, not only in your own body, but in your environment, in your relationships, in all aspects of life, and how important it is in that healing journey. And thirdly, about connection. Connection is so important in healing, and it's so much about that belonging. It's about having trust, meaningful relationships, meaningful life and opportunities, and an opportunity to giving back. Most survivors do not want to be seen as victims. They want to be acknowledged for what they've survived, and they want to be acknowledged for what they have not only done to survive, but thrive. And it's important that we acknowledge the wisdom they bring, that they not only have lived experience, but lived expertise that can inform the way we respond to survivors. So whether you're a survivor out there tonight or someone who works with survivors, let's join shoulder to shoulder to change things and use some of these lenses to help us develop our wisdom and understanding about child sexual abuse and move forward together, honouring the journey of survivors.